It's very timely that we have Dr. Doug Kelly, who's going to be up next. Dr. Kelly is the Deputy Director of Science, Food, and the Drug Administration Centers for Devices and Radiologic Health. That's the FDA CDRH. And Dr. Reznick, I think, is going to mediate here.
So just very quickly, in September, the American Brain Coalition leadership met with the senior leadership of the FDA, including the commissioner, Dr. Robert Califf. And during the meeting, the FDA leadership expressed their support for engaging with the patient advocacy community, and agreed that this kind of engagement is really central to their function. And of course it is. And Dr. Jeff Shuren, who is the director of the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health, called our attention to a pilot that was a program that was included in the user fee package, and that's called the Total Product Lifecycle Advisory Program. And the idea is that, as Dr. Kelly will explain, is to bring companies working on new concept together with patients, providers, and payers. And we're thrilled to have Dr. Doug Kelly with us today. He is, the title is wrong. He's the FDA, Deputy, let's see, what is it? The Deputy Director for Science of the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health, or CDRH. I think I have that right, Doug. But anyway, you can correct me, and please, we're looking forward to listening to you and to have you take some questions as you finish.
Thank you very much. I apologize. My lawn guys decided this is the perfect time to blow leaves off my porch right in front of my office. So if it gets too noisy, somebody let me know. I'll go yell at them. Thank you so much. I am the Deputy Center Director for Science at FDA, Jeff Shuren's deputy. And just by way of background, I spent, after medical school, I decided I wanted to start a biotech company. So I went to business school at Stanford, got an MBA. And then instead of going back to medicine, I ended up becoming a partner with one of my professors who taught my venture capital class. He ran the oldest venture capital firm on the West Coast, asset management, and was the original investor in Amgen, Applied Biosystems, the first industrial gene sequencer, and Coherent Laser, the first industrial laser company. And then the list went on and on. And I guess he wanted somebody who was an MD and who could pronounce all the big words. And so I signed up for that job. And I stayed with the same group of guys for 30 years. My partners included Mike Hunkapiller, who invented the gene sequencer back at Lee Hood's lab at Caltech, Leighton Reed, who invented the gene chip with Steve Fodor at Harvard and started a company called Affymetrix, and a number of other people. So it was, I was the dumb guy in the group, but they let me hang out anyway. And in the course of my career there, I spent most of my time investing in new companies, usually seed stage or early stage at least. And if we didn't find a company that we liked, I'd start one and I'd run it until I reached my level of competency in 6 weeks, whichever came first, and find somebody else to come run it. I had been a big critic of the FDA since almost everything I invested in was regulated by the FDA. And at some point in early 2020, Jeff Shuren asked me if I would consider coming and being his deputy in the device branch. At the time, COVID was taking off. In calendar year 2020, for a staff of 1,900 people at the FDA, we had 400,000 inbounds just on COVID. So it was clear that the old way of doing things was not going to work. When I came, one of the first things I worked on was the Medical Device User Fee Act and created a strategy for trying to improve the medtech ecosystem and see more products make it out into the hands of doctors and patients. That became the basis for this program called TAP, which I'm going to get into. And I'm going to share my screen here. I'm going to blaze through a bunch of slides, so don't be intimidated by the number. Go. Can everybody see that? Great. There we go. So this is the typical consulting chevronogram that shows how ideas go all the way to patient access. You know, it goes through the FDA, and then the problem is that FDA has been very focused on this part of the process, and nothing here on the back end. And so what happens is that, at least for the breakthrough program, over 95% of the breakthrough products that come through the FDA do not make it to commercial adoption. And it's a very high failure rate. And part of that is because the founders, unfortunately, view the FDA as the hard guys to get over. And so they decide instead, I'll do the cheapest and small study I can to get my FDA approval. But the problem is that you end up with payers and professional societies and patient advocacy groups that demand a higher level of evidence for their support. And when you find that out, and a lot of these founders find that out, they end up, it turns out that they can't raise money because the investors say that they haven't really reduced any risk, and so they're not really willing to pay very much for it. And that often results in a fire sale to a big incumbent like a Medtronic. That founder doesn't go back and raise more money because he had a failure. The investors who invested in that company will never do another medtech company. And so you see this hollowing out of the medtech ecosystem, which is unfortunate. And the issue is that we have a lot of stakeholders. It's the FDA, providers, payers, patients, hospital purchasing managers, a number of others I didn't say here. But the issue is that nobody owns this problem. And all these stakeholders tend to be pretty siloed. They have their reasons for wanting what the evidence they want. They're all legitimate, but nobody talks to one another. So when I came to the FDA, I decided this was the big problem that we needed to solve. So MedTech has known about this for a long time. AdvaMed, the big industrial advocacy group, pointed this out. They call it the Valley of Death. And they've known about it, but nobody's doing anything about it. And if you look at how the numbers of money, the amounts of money they're invested, you can see here that MedTech has been pretty flat for a long time. And biotech, it's gone crazy. It used to be in the San Francisco Bay Area and Boston, you couldn't shake a tree without having a CEO of a $1 trillion company fall out of it. That does not exist in the mid-tech world. And there's some structural reasons why that's the case. So we decided to address it with something we call the Total Product Lifecycle Advisory Program. The total product life cycles from product ideation all the way through to commercialization and ultimately many iterations and then obsolescence. And the idea is twofold. We divide the problem up into two parts. One is to bring all these people together and for companies to make their case at the very early stages when their burn rate is really low and they can make big strategic shifts for not much cost. And to ask patients, are these the endpoints that you're interested in? Is this the structure of the trial that you could participate in? To ask the providers and the professional societies, what do you need to be incorporated in the practice guidelines? And what evidence do I need to get you to get my CPT 3 code? And then lastly, for payers, what evidence do you need? And how can I structure my study so I can get you what you need? If you need a durability study, it means that I have to, before I start my study, I have to go and get it approved to have a rollover where I can consent patients appropriately so I don't have to chase them down after I finish my initial clinical study. Instead, maybe I could just roll them over into a 1, 2, 3 year, 4, 5 year study, whatever the payers are interested in. And then the second part of TAP is to make sure that we have essentially internal consultants who are like Sherpas. They understand the FDA and FDA process. 70% of the people that come to us at FDA is their first time. And so the goal of these people is to troubleshoot what they're experiencing, but also to get rapid, low formality dialogue, much more business-like dialogue than has existed in the past with the FDA, which has been, as of recently, very formal, very stiff, and it just takes too long. So again, this is another way of looking at the problem. We bring everybody together at the beginning, hopefully so we can get around the problems that you saw earlier, and you end up solving or actually having us execute our public health mandate, which is timely patient access to safe and effective medical devices. We can approve stuff all day long, but if patients don't get access to it, we're wasting our time. So again, here's another way of looking at it. Then instead of doing a study and then having to rework it and get people to, to beg, plead, and for people to take whatever data that we've managed to generate, instead, if we could do a single study or a smaller number of studies that get things done, and you can figure that out up front, that's probably a much more sustainable way to run a business. This talks about the communication that we typically have with people now with something called the pre-sub program, where you're allowed to ask questions about one subject. It's typically very long, months-long time before you can ask a second one. And this is just not a normal way of communicating as humans. The way that humans typically communicate is like this. It's like when you're asking your spouse where you want to go on vacation. It doesn't happen, in one meeting with lawyers in the room. It happens over a number of conversations, informal conversations over a long period of time. So you figure out your spouse likes the mountains, they hate the beach, they want an active vacation, whatever it is that they want, you figure that out. Over time, you get to a meeting of the minds, and that's where we're trying to get to with FDA communication. And that is the gist of the program. Let me stop sharing here. And why is it relevant to the American Brain Coalition? Well, the first therapeutic area we're going to start on is cardiovascular, but the next most likely one is in neuroscience. So it's something that will be of interest to your members. The people that are eligible for it are companies that have a breakthrough product, and they haven't had any substantial meetings with the FDA yet. And that way we can bring together all the stakeholders, and especially as we talked about earlier, patient advocacy groups to talk about what's really important to them. And that's the gist of the program.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kelly. And as we're waiting for some questions to come in, I thought maybe I would start.
Sure.
So in the presentation, you described a very interesting and interactive and potentially transformative system of going through not only approval, but making a product palatable and acceptable. The question I have is, right now, this is limited only to devices and diagnostics.
Yes.
So is there a plan to because those of us interested in therapies for brain disease, yeah, absolutely, devices and diagnostics are going to be relevant, but so are drugs, so are biologics, so are perhaps even nutraceuticals. And how do we move towards a way to generate a seamless garment? Would that be through this program?
Ultimately, yes. In my initial discussions at the commissioner's office when I first proposed this, Janet Woodcock had told me that if this worked for the device branch, that they'd consider rolling it out across the entire FDA. But make no mistake, this is a fundamental change in the way that the FDA does business. This is it's a complete change in the mindset of reviewers and review staff in the FDA. It's a way of communicating. It's much faster than the way we've done it before. We will end up being fast enough that companies will not be able to keep up with us, which is kind of where we want to be. We want to be at the point where we're pushing the system that hard just to see, what is the maximum that we need. But it causes us to rethink everything that we do in the FDA, our workflow, how we measure it, how we audit it for industry. So the industry pays half of our budget. Want to make sure that they know that they're getting value for it. And again, it starts with breakthrough products, but we really set this up as to be kind of a prototype shop for CDRH, for the device and diagnostics branch. It's really important for companies that are doing things like I know Amit Ekin's work at the Ekin lab at Stanford and his work in circuitry, brain circuitry, and I think there's probably nothing more exciting. So having an FDA that's prepared to meet that work where they are and helping them gather the information they don't have, and maybe with the connections that they don't have that we can get at FDA. The FDA is the first institution that people come to that says, okay, you say you can do all this stuff, well, prove it. And they typically come early in their product development. So again, while their burn rate is low, it's really hard to change strategy when you're burning $3 million a month. It's really easy to do when you're burning $100,000. And so if you're going to have impact on a company in terms of just what do you think about as the CEO, you can't just outsource your knowledge of payers, and you can't outsource your regulatory stuff. Regulatory risk is really business risk. It's how much do we want to know about our patients? How much do we want to know about our device? How big is this market? What are our patients willing to accept? You know, what's their level of risk they're willing to tolerate? How much evidence do we need to generate? These are all really fundamental business questions that determines how much money you're going to have to raise, you know, how well capitalized your company is going to be, and how sustainable your company is going to be at the end of the day. And do you make your stakeholders, you take them from being orange traffic cones in your way and turn them into advocates, and not just advocates, but evangelists for getting what you want out. And if they're not being evangelists, it makes you think, maybe I should really rethink about what I'm doing. Maybe I'm not, maybe the dogs aren't going to eat the dog food, and I should focus on something else.
May I ask a question, Mark?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kelly. I don't know if you saw my hand, Mark, but
Katie informed me.
Oh.
Your hand is very tiny.
This is, well, you know,
We're not going there. Don't worry about it.
I wonder, thanks so much, Dr. Kelly. It sounds like you have a good business acumen, and you probably used to thinking of failing fast the way folks do in business, and you think in a systems kind of way rather than a sort of linear way with bottlenecks that delay things with a.
Well, I am a systems biologist.
That right. So from cells to systems to souls, you know, all the way from the smallest to the largest, that we have to do this.
You just went on mute, Matt. You just went.
I'm wondering, yeah, no, this sort of conciliant thinking. I'm wondering how actually you implement the processes that you showed. You showed a sort of flow diagram with loops and reassessment and feedback for course corrections. And how do you actually implement that at the FDA? We have been advocating for something like an oncology center of excellence, recognizing that, you know, there are a lot, you know, there need to be resources to support something like that, but recognizing that might not be the best model. It seems like you're presenting a best model for getting things done efficiently and in a timely way. How exactly do you do that? What are the logistics? Are you using agile processes? Are you adopting techniques from industry to help operate within the federal government? How do you do it? And do you have any sort of recipe?
Yeah, well, I've run a lot of startups. I've invested in a lot of startups. I've sat on a lot of boards of startups, so I kind of understand how they're organized, and I understand how you have to live with a certain degree of uncertainty and knowledge that you're going to fail at some number of things that you do. That's just baked into the process. And so how we're planning on doing it is kind of a diversity of approaches early on until we winnow out which ones are working, which ones aren't. That is a really different way of thinking for the FDA. Just professionally, folks inside the FDA are not used to saying failure is going to be tolerated. So to say that let's try a bunch of things, we know some of them won't work out, and I'm not going to ding you for doing something that's not working. But one thing I will tell you is that it will be better than what exists now. So instead, let's try a bunch of things and see what works and what doesn't. So we realized in the beginning, it's going to be, as we say in the startup world, a lot of duct tape and baling wire. That it's not going to be pretty in the beginning, and that's okay. And as you move forward, you learn how to programmatize those things that are really working and make it so they're sustainable over the long term. In the beginning, a lot of these things typically end up being kind of very personality based. It's based on what that one person knows who's working in this case in the TAP program, and what their background is. But at some point, you start locking these things down, and then you learn to experiment with the other things. So it's going to be kind of loosey-goosey in the beginning. At the same time, you know, I just presented to the AdvaMed board of directors, which is the big industry trade group, and all these guys on the board all know how this works. They've all run companies from smaller companies to big companies, so they understand that that's how this is put together. What they need to know is that the people involved are going to be answerable and responsible with what they're doing, and that there'll be a degree of transparency, because ultimately I'm going to ask them for a lot of transparency. So we have to go first, and I'm happy to be completely transparent in what we're doing, tell you what's working and what's not, and solicit advice. In the case of patient advocacy, one of the things that we're working with is Michelle Tarver's group at FDA inside CDRH in an office called OST, the Office of Science and Technology. It's really the office that does a lot of partnerships and what have you. She is an ophthalmologist by training, but also has a PhD from Johns Hopkins in essentially patient econometrics, and has done a lot of patient choice studies. And what we want to do is be able to apply some of that learning to this TAP program so patient advocacy can be optimized in a way that gets patient advocates what they are looking for, but also engages them in a way that they haven't been engaged before. I think it's really, really important. And a lot of patient advocacy groups are not set up to do that. And frankly, the FDA has not been set up with the toeholds that they need to figure out how do they get engaged. So that's one of the big things we're going to work on as well. And it's the same with the payers and the hospital purchasing managers and professional societies. A lot of these folks have wanted to work with the FDA, they just haven't really known how. And so part of what I'm going to do is I'm going to give them a toehold and say, what are your ideas? And we'll try them out. And if it doesn't work, we'll try something else until we get something that does work.
How can we help you with that? We have this sort of marketplace of ideas coming from, so many different patient advocacy organizations who have boots on the ground and can give reality checks and input into new drugs, needs, drug development, aftermarket effects. How can we help with that?
Well, like I said, the woman at FDA who's really our patient sciences point person is Michelle Tarver. Her email address is michelle.tarver, Tarver, at fda.hhs.gov. That's the standard formula for FDA addresses or email addresses. And
Thanks,
she is
Michelle.
really the point person on the patient access stuff.
But I think it's important to mention, Doug, that ABC, while it exists as an umbrella patient advocacy group, also has the neuroscientists and the clinicians that take care of brain disease. And that, so as a result, we would really be more than simply, we would represent the patient, but represent the patient from the standpoint of those who are trying to do the research and the treatment as well.
Mhm.
So is there another avenue then that ABC might be involved, or another?
Well, so here's the limitation of what we're looking to do. It's a voluntary program by the companies. So, and they're really, in a sense, driving the boat. So we give them a menu of things that they can choose from, and then they choose it. And if they already know professional societies, that's fine. If you want to do an additional program or additional forum that would be helpful to companies in specific areas, for example, if you had researchers that were doing work in particular areas and companies were interested in getting involved in those things because it helps them develop their, in our case, medical device or diagnostic, then we'd be happy to set that up. But that's kind of the limitation of this is nothing that we can force on these companies. It really has to come from them. So it has to be an offering to them that they see adds value ultimately in getting their product approved and commercialized.
And then I have a question that came in on the Q&A. And I'm going to try and paraphrase it. Basically, we all agree that all of us benefit from diversity. And this question is specifically about diversity in clinical trials. And one of the sub aims of it is, should the FDA, in combination with the ABC, develop a policy statement on diversity in clinical trials? And secondly, do you think, and I think this is more general, but that it would be appropriate to have a congressional neuroscience caucus program with the workforce diversity head from the NIH and someone who's involved with diversity, equity, and inclusion from one of the patient advocacy groups whom we represent?
Well, let me put it this way. On the policy side, I can't say what you guys should do.
Right.
But no, I mean, just it's not that it's inappropriate for me. It's be stupid for me because you have your mission and you have your policies that you need to make that happen. And that's nothing that FDA can say yay or nay on that would make a difference. I will tell you that part of what we're trying to get to is that I think that 90 or 95% of the time, FDA, industry, patient advocates, insurance companies, and everybody else, all the stakeholders are largely aligned. The problem is they all speak different languages and they don't really make it easy for one to understand the other. So for example, for health equity, everybody understands that health equity is an important strategic initiative, both for the FDA and for a lot of payers, for example. And companies that are getting started and are looking for payers ultimately to pay for what they're doing need to understand that having a clinical study that reflects the populations that are their customers and not just a bunch of old white guys probably makes a lot of sense. So the idea that you could somehow get payers to tell people and deliver that message for you, that's a very powerful way. That's a pocketbook way, a dollars and cents way of saying this is important. A company may start out with a particular prejudice, and that prejudice is often driven by lack of resources or lack of funding, that they want to have the simplest study that they can possibly do with the most homogeneous patient population to get a signal for the least amount of money. Whereas payers are interested in a much broader, CMS in particular, but also commercial payers are interested in a much broader patient population that really reflects their membership. So at the end of the day, why is a company going to do this? Well, they're going to do it because getting payers to pay for your stuff earlier makes your company more successful. And also understanding that ultimately that is a risk factor in your commercialization, and knowing that and being able to communicate that to your investors, that is also a really important thing, because part of the problem now is company founders understand very little of the system risk, of the stakeholder risk that they have to wade into when they're commercializing their product. And so as a result, without knowing what that risk is, they tend to have this cycle of failure and rework and failure and rework and raise more money and dilute equity dilution and what have you. It makes much more sense for those people, those founders, to talk to everybody, to talk to your group, to talk to payers, and find out, what do you really want? And if you can communicate that to your investors, and even if it's a lot of money, knowing that up front and not having to make a mid-course change makes you a better CEO. It makes it that you have to raise less capital at the end of the day, less rework, and makes you a more sustainable enterprise. So there's a dollar and cents reason why people should look for solutions for the health equity problems. It's because everybody wants it, and they won't give you money if you don't do anything about it.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kelly, for informing us about what it sounds like an exciting new program to help to bring cures to the patients we represent. And I hope this represents the beginning of a long and beautiful friendship between the ABC and the FDA. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Humphrey Bogart. I hope that happens too. And let me just say to John, who presented before, I mean, I think the brain initiative is just profoundly exciting and some of the most important work in science right now. So thank you, John, for your presentation. It's very tremendously exciting.
Oh, thanks very much. And the slide I had to leave out was calling out our very highly valued federal partners, one of which, of course, is the FDA. And we are working on ways to work more seamlessly so we can get some of these new devices, new therapies into patients safely, of course, but on a more expeditious timeline.
And John, if I can help in any way, my email address is douglas.kellymd@fda.hhs.gov.